Hey everybody, part 3 of Phantom about to start. First, let me just say I don't own the book. Everything is owned by Susan Kay and LLUMINA Stars Publishing. I'd like to say thanks for those who continue to watch these and actually like it. I don't have very good French, so there is a lot of French and stuff mentioned in here, so I'm sorry if I'm not that good at pronouncing it. And, yeah. So yeah, I'm not good at reading this, I don't think, but doing the best. This is done as a charity for those who don't have the book. Alright, let's continue with part 3. He was 5 when we had our confrontation over the mask. Until that terrible summer evening, he wore it with unquestioning obedience, removing it only to sleep, and never setting foot beyond the confines of the attic bedroom without it. So fiercely unbending was my regime that he would no more have considered appearing without it than he would have considered appearing naked. At least, that is what I thought until that night. It was the evening of his 5th birthday, and I was expecting Marie for supper. I hadn't invited her. With the stubborn grain of well-meaning, she had issued an ultimatum, insisting that I celebrate an event which until now I had contrived to ignore. "You can't continue to let the occasion pass unmarked," she told me with a curious finality that brooked no opposition. "I shall bring him a present, and we shall all take supper together in a civilized manner." I spent the day in the kitchen, with the door closed, contriving to keep myself busy so that I need not be reminded of the reason for this grim farce. I might have been preparing to feed the entire village. Batches of cakes and tarts issued in an insane procession from my oven, but still, I went on mixing and stirring in the still, stifling heat, like a woman possessed. And all the time I worked, I was aware of the piano playing softly in the drawing room. It did not come pestering like a normal child, begging to lick the spoon or steal a cake with the healthy impatience of his age. His complete indifference to food was merely another source of conflict between us. At length, when I went and told him to go upstairs and put on his best clothes, he turned on the piano stool to look at me with surprise. "It isn't Sunday. Is Father Francois coming to say Mass again?" "No," I replied, wiping my hands on my apron and not looking at him directly. "It's your birthday." He stared at me blankly, and I felt a perfectly unreasonable irritation rising inside at the shameful necessity of explaining this basic phenomenon. "The anniversary of your birth," I said shortly. "You were born 5 years ago today, and the event should be celebrated." "Like a requiem?" For a second I wondered if he was mocking me, but the eyes fixed on mine were entirely innocent and puzzled. "Not exactly," I said with difficulty. "Then there won't be a Dies Irae?" I heard the sudden disappointment in his voice. "Or an Agnus Dei?" "No, but there will be a special supper." I saw his interest shrivel and his glance wander back to score on which he had been working. "And a present," I found myself adding suddenly. "Mademoiselle Pivot is bringing you a present, Eric. I expect you to remember your manners and thank her nicely." He turned to look at me curiously, and for a horrible moment I thought I was going to be obliged to explain that too. But he said no more, only continued to gaze at me thoughtfully. "Go upstairs and get changed while I set the table," I told him hastily. As I pulled the tablecloth from the drawer, I was aware that he had made no effort to move. "Mama, what is it now?" I demanded irritably. "Will you give me a present, too?" I put the napkins out on the table with a trembling hand. "Of course," I replied mechanically. "Is there something particular that you want?" He came to stand beside me, and something about his taut silence made me suddenly very uneasy. I sensed that he was afraid of my refusal, so no doubt whatever it was he wanted was going to be highly expensive. "May I have anything I want?" he asked uncertainly. "Within reason." May I have 2 of them? Why should you need 2? I inquired warily. So that I can save one for when the other is used up. I began to relax. This didn't sound very alarming. Nothing more extravagant than a ream of good quality paper, by the sound of it, or perhaps a box of sweets. What is it that you want? I demanded with sudden confidence. Silence. I watched him playing with the napkins. Eric, I've had quite enough of this silly game now. If you don't tell me what you want straight away, you will have nothing at all. He jumped at the sharpness of my tone and began to twist a napkin between his fingers. I want to. He stopped and put his hand on the table, and though to steady himself. For God's sake, I snapped. To what? He looked at me. Kisses, he whispered tremulously. One now and one to save. I started at him in horror, and without any warning burst into uncontrollable tears and sank down at the table. You must not ask that, I sobbed. You must never ask that again. Do you understand me? Eric, never. He shrank from my noisy grief and horror and backed away to the door. Why are you crying? He stammered. I made a mighty effort to control myself. I'm not crying, I gasped. Yes, you are, he shouted in a voice that was suddenly ugly with rage. You're crying and you won't give me my birthday present. You made me ask. You made me ask. And then you said no. Well, I don't want a birthday. I don't like birthdays. I hate them. The doors slammed behind him, and a moment later I heard the echoing bang from upstairs. I sat where he had left me, staring at the napkin he had thrown on the floor. When at last I stood up warily, it was to see Marie walking purposely up the garden path, with a parcel under her arm. As we sat down together at the table, I was dreadfully aware of the empty place setting. Where is he? Asked Marie, broaching the subject that had been between us since her arrival. In his room, I said grimly. He won't come out. I've called him several times, but you know what he's like. There is nothing to be done with him when he flies into one of those tantrums. Marie looked at the parcel she had placed on the chiffonier. Does he know it's his birthday? Of course he knows, I said angrily. Lifting the lid off the tureen, I began to ladle soup a little wildly into her bowl, trying desperately to recapture the determined, busy mania which kept my terrible thoughts at bay. As long as my hands were moving, my mind remained blissfully numb, and I could avoid facing my own wicked inadequacy as a mother. A mother who could not bring herself to kiss her only child, not even on his birthday, not even when he begged. The tragic dignity of his request had unnerved me so much that my hands were still shaking. I spilled soup on the cream lace of the tablecloth and mopped it up with a muttered curse. The door behind me opened and I stood rigid, watching Marie's face turn white and her hand fly instinctively to her mouth. Horror in her eyes lasted for only a split second before she regained her composure sufficiently to force her slack lips into a strained smile. Good evening, Eric dear. How nice you look in that new suit. Come and sit beside me and have your supper. Then afterward we shall open your present. When I turned and saw him standing there in the open doorway, without the mask, my heart seemed to stop dead in my breast. He had done this for spite. He had done this to punish and humiliate me. How dare you? I spat. How dare you do this, you wicked child? Madeleine, Marie half rose in her chair, one hand outstretched to me in a nervous gesture of appeal. It really doesn't matter. Be silent, I snapped. I will deal with this without your interference. Eric, go back to your room and put on the mask. If you ever do this again, I shall whip you for it. He shivered, and the grotesquely malformed lips puckered, as though he was about to cry. But still he stood there stubbornly, both hands clenched into fists of defiance. I don't like the mask, he muttered. It's hot, and it hurts me. It makes sore places. I could see those places now, beneath the hollow sockets of his eyes. The livid flesh, thin as parchment, had been rubbed raw by the constant pressure of a mask which was evidently too tight. Because I did not look at him more closely when I had to, I had failed to notice how much he had grown. Go to your room, I repeated unsteadily. I shall make a new mask after supper, and you will not come down without it again. Do you hear me, Eric? Never. Why? He demanded sullenly. Why must I always wear the mask? No one else has to. A red mist of rage swam before my eyes, an explosion of fury that blew the last shreds of my self-control into pieces. I flew at him and began to shake him so savagely that I heard his teeth rattle. Madeleine! Sobbed Marie helplessly. Madeleine, for pity's sake! He wants to know why? I screamed at her. Then he shall know. By God, he shall know. I dug my nails into the thin material of his shirt and dragged him from the room, up the stairs, before the only mirror in the house. Look at yourself, I spat. Look at yourself in the mirror and see why you must wear a mask. Look. He stared at the glass with such dumb, disbelieving horror that all the fury shriveled and died within me. And then, before I could stop him, he screamed and flung himself at the mirror, pummeling the glass with his clenched fists in a mad frenzy of terror. The glass shattered. Shards flew in all directions, embedding themselves in his wrists and fingers, so that suddenly he was bleeding from dozens of lacerations, but still he went on screaming and pounding the fractured mirror with bloody hands. And when I tried to restrain him, he bit me like a wild animal that was out of its mind with fear. A hand fell on my arm. Marie's voice, very cold and determined, told me to go downstairs and find bandages. When I returned, she had coaxed him from the debris of smashed glass and was picking the silvers from his fingers with a pair of tweezers. I could not watch. I waited for her in the drawing room, but she did not come back down again. I assumed that she had put him to bed and was sitting with him. I did not dare go upstairs and see. Worming my way into the farthest corner of the sofa, I spent the rest of my night stitching steadily at a new mask and staring into the empty hearth. Shortly before dawn, when he woke screaming from the first of what proved to be a long succession of nightmares, she came into the room with a cradle in her hand, looking gray and drained, and angry. He's asking for you, she said grimly. God knows why, but it's you he wants. Go upstairs and comfort him. She stood in front of me like an avenging angel, and I shrank from her uncompromising figure. I can't, I whispered. I can't go to him. Without warning, she suddenly leaned forward and dealt me a resounding slap across the cheek. Get up, she stormed. Get up, you spoiled, sniveling brat. All your life you've been spoiled. By your parents, by Charles, by me, everyone pandering to Madeleine. Dear, pretty Madeleine. Well, it's not enough simply to be pretty, do you hear me, Madeleine? It doesn't excuse you from human obligations. It doesn't permit you to poison a child's mind and cripple his soul. It should hang for what you have done to him since he was born. You should burn. She struck me again and then turned away, sobbing hopelessly and sinking into the chair beside the hearth. And shocked as I was, I found myself remembering the day I had found her in the dormitory at the convent, standing on the bed to avoid the huge spider that sat peacefully in her path to the door. Get rid of it, but don't hurt it, she had begged me with white-faced intensity. It can't help being ugly. I had dropped a book on the spider in my brisk, heartless manner and squashed it nicely. She had refused to speak to me for days afterward. I could not get that picture out of my head. As I dragged myself up the staircase with one hand against my burning cheek, I could not forget the mangled spider. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I heard renewed terror in Eric's cry. "Mama! Mama!" "Hush," I murmured. "It's me, Eric. Hush now." I heard him sigh with relief as I walked into the room. One small bandaged hand groped briefly in my direction, then subsided warily back on the coverlet. "I don't feel well," he complained fretfully. "I know." I sat stiffly on the edge of my bed, thinking how small he looked in its great expense. How small and how helpless. "I'm sorry. Go back to sleep now, and you'll feel better in the morning." He clutched at the coverlet in alarm. "I don't want to go to sleep," he panted. "If I go to sleep, it will come back. The face will come back." I closed my eyes and swallowed hard over the lump which seemed to be blocking my air passage. "Eric," I said helplessly, "you must try to forget about the face now." "I can't forget it," he whispered. "It was there in the mirror, and it frightened me. Did you see it? Mama, did you see it too?" "Eric, that face will never hurt you." "I don't want it to come back," he sobbed wildly. "I want you to make it go away forever." I took a deep breath and looked down on the little corpse face against the pillow. The deep-socketed eyes were staring desperately into mine, seeking the reassurance that I alone could give. And I knew then that, in spite of his rapidly burgeoning genius, he was still too young to bear the reality of this burden. "This mask will make the face go away," I said as gently as I could. "As long as you wear it, you'll never see the face anymore." "Is the mask magic?" he demanded with sudden passionate interest. "Yes." I bowed my head, so that our eyes no longer met. "I made it magic to keep you safe. The mask is your friend, Eric. As long as you wear it, no mirror can ever show you the face again." He was silent then, and when I showed him the new mask, he accepted it without question, and put it on hastily with his clumsy bandaged fingers. But when I stood up to go, he reacted with panic and clutched at my gown. "Don't go. Don't leave me here in the dark." "You are not in the dark," I said patiently. "Look, I have left the candle." But I knew, as I looked at him, that it would have made no difference if I had left him 50 candles. The darkness he feared was in his own mind, and there was no light in the universe powerful enough to take that darkness from him. With a sigh of resignation, I sat back on the bed and began to sing softly, and before I had finished that first verse, he was asleep. The bandages on his hands and wrists showed white and eerie in the candlelight. As I eased my skirts from his grasp, I knew that Marie was right. Physically and mentally, I had scarred him for life. I became altogether reliant on Father Francois for the sensible management of Eric's soul and intellect. When he suggested sending examples of the child's design to the School of Fine Arts in Paris, I made no murmur of protest. I knew that he had an old acquaintance there, a friend who had once shared his education at the Lycée Henri IV, and now lectured on architecture. If Professor Giswat could be persuaded to take an interest in my son, I was ready to accept whatever advice or assistance he might be prepared to give me. Eric was already showing signs of boredom, and when he was bored, he was unbearably badly behaved and inclined to dangerous mischief. He could not be sent to school, and I had little chance of engaging a tutor suitable to his extraordinary needs. Professor Gizois seemed to be my only hope of preserving sanity, and I awaited his visit with a growing degree of desperation. He did not hurry down to Boischerville, and when he finally arrived, I sensed he was extremely skeptical. Like Father Francois, he was in late middle age, portly and a little pompous in bearing. In spite of his studied courtesy, it was quite obvious that he considered he had been dragged from Paris on a wild goose chase. I believe it was only out of a sense of obligation to an old school friend that he had come at all, and he appeared determined to look upon the occasion as a little holiday. He seemed more interested in discussing the possibility of duck shooting in the neighboring village of Duclair, and it was with a feeling of increasing despair that I finally suggested, rather pointedly, that he might like to talk to Eric. "Ah, yes," he observed with a sudden quite unmistakable coolness entering his voice. "The child prodigy. By all means, show him in, madam. I am sure I shall not need to detain him over long." He measured me with a look of unveiled suspicion, and I felt myself flushing hotly beneath his glance. When Eric came into the room, I saw the professor's guarded surprise at the sight of the mask, but he made no comment. He shook hands with the boy, and waited patiently for him to climb onto a chair at the dining-room table, before placing a sheet of paper in front of him and asking him to name what he saw. "It's an arch," said Eric politely. "A basket arch." "That is correct." I heard mild astonishment in the professor's voice. "Perhaps you would like to show me the keystone," Eric pointed. "The abutment and the impost." Eric pointed again, and I saw the professor frown. "Center span, haunch, and crown," he barked in quick succession. "Voici extras." Eric's finger moved unerringly across the sheet, and I heard him give a faint sigh of boredom at this dull and apparently pointless exercise. The professor took out a handkerchief and passed it across his mottled forehead. He suddenly looked uncomfortably warm. "What is the springing line?" he demanded with abrupt aggression. "The level at which an arch springs from its supports," Eric replied calmly. The professor sat down unexpectedly and stared at the child. "Draw me 10 different types of arches and name them," he ordered. Eric glanced across at me impatiently. I knew he was insulted by the simplicity of the task, but when I glared at him, he picked up the lead and began to draw with swift obedience. I withdrew from the room at the point and left them altogether. 3 hours later, when the professor joined me in the drawing room, he was in his shirt sleeves. He looked disheveled and exhausted, not at all the worldly, rather supercilious gentleman who had entered my house with such aplomb shortly after noon. "Madam," he said solemnly, "I must thank you for permitting me the most remarkable experience of my entire academic career." I had the glance to remain silent, for I sensed he had something difficult to say, and that he was not a man to whom Grace's apology came easily. "I have to confess that I came here today fully expecting to expose a rather clever hoax," he admitted uncomfortably. "When I received those designs in Paris, my first thought was that my old friend had become the victim of a confidence trick. I am afraid I suspected you, madame, of taking advantage of a kindly and over-credulous nature for your own spurious purposes." I stared at him without comment, and he spread his thick hands in a gesture of defeated wonder. "What can I say to you, madame? You must already be well aware that your son's advancement is little short of preternatural." I clasped my hands together in relief. "Then you admit he's genius?" He shook his head slowly. "Genius is a human attribute. What I have seen today cannot be defined by any word that is known to me. His aptitude is quite beyond belief. Madame, I should find it extraordinarily difficult to resist shaping such boundless talent." I closed my eyes briefly, feeling as though a great weight had been taken from my shoulders. The professor fell silent for a moment, fingering the jacket that lay over one arm, and suddenly all my uneasiness returned. I understand from Father Mertois' letter that there is a serious physical deformity that precludes his attendance at any of our usual seats of educational excellence. This is correct, I said, faintly aware that my heart had began to sink. Forgive me, madam, but would it be improper to inquire? The mask? I bit my lip. You wish to know the reason for the mask? I must admit to finding it somewhat eccentric, even disturbing. In this age of enlightenment, one hardly expects to find a child imprisoned in such a fashion. Surely, no accident of birth, however severe, can warrant so primitive a measure. My head jerked up at the ignorant criticism. You wish to see? I demanded coldly. You are prepared to show no disgust, no fear that would distress him? He smiled faintly. I think you will find that I am a man of the world, he assured with the contemptuous confidence. And you will not allow what you see to interfere with your previous judgment. Now he was quite plainly insulted. Madam, we are not living in the 16th century. This is an age of empirical and rational judgment. So you think, I said. With a shrug, I went to the door, called Eric into the room, and removed the mask. I have to admit that Professor Griswold was as good as his word. He lost his high, port wine coloring as the blood fled from his pendulous cheeks, leaving them gray and flaccid. But not by a flicker of his eye or a twitch of his white lips did he betray what he must have felt when he looked at the child's dead face. When we were alone once more, I indicated the chair by the fire. You may sit if you wish, monsieur. Thank you. He sat down by the hearth, arranging his jacket across his knees, with a furtive gesture of shaken nerves. I wonder if I might trouble you for a glass of water, he said huskily. I brought him brandy instead, and he accepted it without question, gulping at the rich brown liquid with relief, before setting it down on the little circular table beside him and with a trembling hand. I think you will now allow the necessity of a mask, I said. Yes, he replied in a tone of deep feeling. I very much fear that I do. And? I prompted inexorably. He glanced at the empty brandy glass with regret, but I did not offer him any more. A terrible fear and anger was starting to build inside of me. I had intended, if you were agreeable, to take the boy into my own household, where I might instruct him at my leisure, and make arrangements for him to take his baccalaureate. But now I see such an arrangement would not be possible. My wife, you understand, is of a nervous disposition, and we have inquisitive neighbors. No, I fear it is quite unthinkable. I have my position in society to consider. I clenched my fists. You will not teach him. Madam, he protested helplessly. I knew you would refuse once you've seen. Madam, I beseech you to be reasonable. This child is a monstrous freak. I did not say that, he retorted with dignity. And I must beseech you not to put words into my mouth. I have every intention of teaching him, I assure you, but it could not be done in Paris, where I am so much in the public eye. How then? I whispered. He got up from his chair and laid one hand on my arm in a fatherly fashion. I do not consider he will require the constant supervision demanded by most students. It will be a question of providing guidelines and stimulation. This case is a challenge, madame, a test of my professional ingenuity. You may rest assured that I shall establish a means of study entirely appropriate to the rather singular circumstances in which we found ourselves. I felt tears of gratitude welling up into my eyes, and turned away hastily before they could fall. "You are very kind," I murmured. "My dear lady," he sighed, "I am not kind. I am fascinated." It was as well that I had been left in comfortable circumstances at Charles' death, for otherwise the cost of Eric's unique education would have pauperized us. I was obliged to lease my father's house in Rouen in order to provide him with the tools of his study. But I did not begrudge him the only happiness I was capable of giving. Father Binsois lined every room in the house with bookshelves, and month after month the obscure and weighty tomes, some of them rare editions, continued to arrive from Paris, accompanied by the instructions and lecture notes from the professor. He came himself at regular intervals to spend the entire day closeted with his eager pupil. "One day," he told me with barely conceited excitement, "this boy will astonish the world." When he spoke of the Grand Prix de Rome and of his determination that Eric should be the youngest ever entered for that coveted prize, I made no comment. Nor did I correct the child when he spoke of the 5 years he expected to spend studying architecture at the Villa Medici as a pensionnaire of the French Academy. Neither I nor the professor was prepared to admit to ourselves that castles in the air were the only things Eric would never be given the opportunity to build. Like two ostriches, we buried our heads in sand and refused to look on the ugliness of reality. I dared not think of the life which lay ahead of Eric beyond the protection of my door, in a world whose sole purpose would be to mock his grotesque appearance. I dared not begin to anticipate the future, but I could not deny him his dreams. Even then I was aware that dreams were all he could ever have. A few months after he had begun to study architecture with Professor Guzwa, Eric asked me for a mirror. I was taken so completely by surprise that I did not know what to say to him. My first instinct was to refuse. But since my instincts were usually wrong, I decided to yield to his bizarre request. Fetching a small hand mirror from the drawer in my room, where I was careful to keep it hidden, I gave it to him with uneasy reluctance. He never spoke about the face, but since I was still regularly awakened by a single scream of terror from his room, I assumed the memory still troubled him. He took the mirror from me with exaggerated care, as though it were a poisonous snake that might bite, and turned it hastily face down upon the table. He was panting a little, as though he had been running hard, and I sensed such fear in him that I was sorely tempted to snatch the mirror away. But I resisted the urge and waited. "If I took off the back," he began hastily, "would I still be able to see things?" "No," I said steadily, "the reverse surface of a mirror reflects no image. You will see nothing at all." His sigh of relief was painfully and unmistakably audible. "It has a safe side, then," he muttered to himself. "That's good." He glanced at me uncertainly. "May I look inside?" "Mamma, if you wish." I watched him remove the backing from the mirror with dexterous fingers, and prise up a loose corner of the tin foil. "It's only glass underneath," he cried, in astonishment. "It's only glass and a piece of tin. How could the face get inside?" I felt cold with misery as he looked up at me. All the brilliance, all that learning, and still the simple truth of this eluded him. "The face was not inside, Eric, it was outside. A mirror merely reflects an image of any object that is placed in front of it." "Then how are the images changed into monsters?" he demanded seriously. "Is it magic? Will you show me how it works?" I felt sobs massing in my throat, and as I took up the mirror and looked into it, I was aware of him straining to see over my shoulder. "Oh, it's not working." he exclaimed with disappointment. "There's nothing there. It must be broken." I altered the angle of the mirror so that my image swam abruptly into his view, and he gave a cry of delight. "Look!" he shouted in great excitement. "There's two of you! The magic has changed." "Eric, there is no magic. Whenever anyone looks into a mirror, they see a reflection of themselves. Nothing else but themselves. A mirror has no power to show a monster unless the monster stands before it." "But I saw one," he insisted angrily. "I saw one." I laid the mirror face downward on the table in front of him. "Yes," I said gently. "I know what you saw." I left him alone then and went into the adjoining room to wait for the first scream of understanding, but it did not come. When I looked in, I saw that he was playing with the mirror, holding it carefully at an angle which did not show him his face. Presently I heard him go upstairs, and when I went to retrieve the mirror from the table, I found it gone. He came down to supper, seeming perfectly calm, and asked if he might have the mirror to keep. Surprised and relieved, I agreed to his request without question, hoping that the trauma of acceptance was now behind us. But next day I found the mirror broken in half a dozen pieces, each one laid carefully face down on the chest of the drawers in his room. When I asked indignantly why he had done this, he explained patiently that it made better magic that way, and he proceeded to prop the pieces of glasses above a drawing at angles, which produced a strange, distorted maze of reflections. "You see, Mama, you were wrong about mirrors," he said triumphantly. "You can make all sorts of magic with them. I wonder if they would show if I bent them. Do you think they would go soft enough to bend if I put them in the fire?" "I have no idea," I said with horror. "And don't you even think of trying such a silly trick. All you will succeed in doing is burning yourself, Eric." "Eric, are you listening to me?" "Yes, Mama," he said innocently. But he did not look at me as he said it, and I was immediately suspicious of such an easy acquiescence. He did not normally give in so easily. I would have taken the pieces of glass away from him on the spot, but I hesitated to provoke one of his terrible rages, which would only end in a savage beating. Perhaps I should be glad that he had overcome his rational terror of such a simple everyday object, and if he burned himself, well, he would not do it again. I decided to leave well enough alone. "Madeleine!" Marie came into the kitchen, and as she closed the door behind her with a furtive gesture, I became aware that her earnest face was seized with anxiety. "I think you should know," she continued uneasily, "that Eric has asked me to buy him some glass and tin and a glass cutter. He gave me this and begged me not to tell you." She held out her palm to display 100 francs, and I frowned. "So that's where the money went." I had my suspicions. "What did you say to him?" She sighed. "Well, of course I knew the money couldn't possibly be his. I told him it was wrong to steal. And he just looked at me, as though he didn't understand a word I was saying." I nodded grimly. "He understands only what he wishes to understand. All he cares for the moment is satisfying this morbid obsession with illusion and magic. And he knows how much it angers me. I told him last week I could not have the glass." "What on earth does he want it for?" "He wants to make mirrors. Can you believe it? Magic mirrors that will show him only what he wants to see. For hundreds of years the Venetians kept the secret of their craft from the rest of the world, and now this child, this crazy child, thinks he can start making mirrors in an attic bedroom. Thank God I never told him about the mercury, or he would have demanded that too, I suppose. What in God's name makes him behave like this?" Marie laid the money on the table and looked at me thoughtfully. "I think you must let him have the glass, which is so very important to him," she said after a moment. "No, oh, really?" I retorted coldly. "Perhaps you think he should have the mercury too, so that he can poison us all when the fancy takes him." She shrugged uneasily. Madeleine, if you don't give that glass to him, he will simply find another way of taking it for himself. Do you want him to start breaking your windows?" I stared at her in horror. "You think he is capable of such wickedness?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't think he would consider it wickedness, Madeleine. Simply the next logical step toward his objective." "The end justifies the means," I said softly, looking inward. "That is the teaching of the devil." She was silent, looking at the floor, and I knew that in her heart she was forced to agree. At the end of the week, when I presented him with the glass and tinfoil, I had to turn away from his cry of delight. He disappeared to his room for the rest of the day, and that evening I found him rigid with fury at his failure. "There must be a better way," he murmured. "I shall ask Professor Gazol when he comes tomorrow." "Mirrors?" echoed the professor vaguely as Eric pounced on him at the front door next day. "Well, of course, we've always used tin and mercury for the backing up till now." "Mercury!" I saw Eric stiffen with annoyance. "I didn't know about the mercury." "It hardly signifies," continued the professor jubilantly. "No one will be using the laborer's old method much longer. I believe a new process called silvering has recently been discovered in Germany." "Germany?" Eric repeated solemnly. "How far away is that?" The dining room door closed behind them, and I heard no more. From that point, I made it my business to keep Eric supplies with any material he asked for, no matter how bizarre the request might seem. Glass, metal, nuts, and bolts, and springs. They were toys that I no longer denied him, for the simple reason that I dared not. I was beginning to understand the danger of attempting to block the natural outlet of an active volcano. It was also beginning to understand that Father Francois's urgent concern for Eric's soul. Ever since he was old enough to walk, I had taken the precaution of locking Eric in his room at night. Partly for his protection, but chiefly for my own peace of mind. He was 8 when I made the unwelcome discovery that barred windows and a locked door were no longer sufficient to contain his captive imagination. Father Francois came to me one morning to considerable anxiety, telling me that there was great unrest in the village and that I must take more care to keep Eric inside at night. "I don't understand you," I frowned. "You know quite well that he is never permitted to go beyond the garden." The priest shook his head. "Madeleine, he has been seen by more than one person in the church grounds, and last night several witnesses insist they heard the organ playing at midnight." "But that's not possible, Father," I protested. "I myself locked him in his room at 8 o'clock. "Did you leave the key in the door?" "Yes, but that is exactly where I found it this morning. Even if he had contrived to push the key from the lock and slide it underneath the door, he could hardly have locked himself in there again once more." "I fear that with Eric all things are possible," said the priest gravely. "I think I had better talk to him." To my intense dismay, Eric made no attempt to deny his escape. He admitted it quite freely and only bowed his head when Father Francois rebuked him for the sin of deceit. "I wasn't doing any harm," he protested, looking at me anxiously, as though he expected me to beat him in front of the priest. "Then what exactly were you doing?" I shouted. "There are foxes in the forest," he said quietly. "I like to watch their cubs playing in the moonlight. Last spring he stopped and gasped at my expression. I could not believe that he had been roaming as far as the Forêt de Romeo for a year or more without my knowledge. I saw very clearly then what had happened. How his gradually mounting confidence had persuaded him to venture deeper and deeper into the village, where the beautiful Romanesque church pulled like a lodestar. "How do you get out of your room?" I demanded. "Oh, that's easy," he admitted. "I just unscrew the bars on the window and jump into the tree outside." I closed my eyes in horror. His room was at least 20 feet above the ground, and the tree he referred to was far enough from the window to make that jump possibly suicidal to anything but a cat. I didn't bother to ask how he managed to get back in. No doubt it was by a method equally lunatic. "You stupid boy, you could have been killed." He looked at the floor. "Everything is so beautiful at night, and no one sees me," he murmured. "Well, last night you were not only seen, you were heard," I snapped. "By now the entire village must know you were playing the organ in the church." "Oh," he said miserably. "I thought if anyone heard, they would think it was a ghost." "Oh, Rick," said Father Francois, venturing hastily as he saw me clench my fists. "What you have been doing is very foolish, and puts both you and your mother at risk. It must not occur again. If you continue to alarm the village in this fashion, there may be unpleasant reprisals." Eric made an instinctive movement toward me and then froze. "You understand what I mean by reprisals, don't you, my child?" "Yes," Eric whispered with horror. "But why? Why would they hurt me? I haven't done any harm. Why do they all hate me?" The priest spread his hands uncomfortably. "Men hate things they fear, and they fear those things which they do not understand." Eric touched the mask hesitantly. "My face?" he faltered. "They hate me because of my face?" Father Francois took his arm. "Come, child, let us pray. We shall ask God to grant you patience and understanding." "No!" Eric pulled away from his grasp abruptly. "I'm not going to pray anymore. Why should I? God doesn't listen to me." "Eric," I gasped, "you will apologize to Father Francois immediately and beg God's forgiveness for such a terrible blasphemy." He was stubbornly silent. "Go to your room," I said icily. "I will deal with your disobedience later." There was an appalled silence when he had left us. I sank into the hearthside chair and stared at the priest. "What can we do?" I breathed. "He must not be allowed to leave the house again," said Father Francois, after a moment. "I will return later to board up his window and place bolts on his door." Board up his window. I echoed wretchedly. Must I now shut him up in a room without natural light? "I fear there is no other way to protect him," the priest said sadly. That night, there were a great disturbance outside in the road, a crowd of village boys throwing stones and shouting obscene abuse. I was so furious that, in spite of the priest's warnings, I threw open my bedroom window and challenged them. "Go away," I screamed. "Go away and leave me and my son in peace." "Bring out the monster," they chatted rudely in response. "Bring out the monster and let us see him, lady." A clot of filth struck me on the cheek. I heard the sound of a downstairs window smashing and held my breath with terror as someone began kicking the front door. "Be off with you," stormed Father Francois' voice from a little distance down the road. "You young devils! I promise you this night will earn you penitence enough to keep you on your knees for a month. Yes, I know your names, every one of you. Be off, I say." The voices grew fainter and less belligerent as their owners sculled away into the falling dusk. Running down the narrow staircase, I wrenched open the front door and buried my face against the priest's habit. "Oh, Father, I thought they were going to break into the house and take him." "I don't think they would dare go that far, my dear, but certainly I couldn't answer for what they would do if they caught him wandering alone. Is he safe upstairs?" I nodded. "Good. I shall remove the glass from his window and fit a bolt at the top of the bottom of his door. I think that will contain him. Indeed, it may well be that, after tonight, he will be too far frightened to try to escape again." "What is to become of him?" I whispered in despair. "What in God's name will become of him?" "It is not for us to foresee the future," he replied, the priest eviously. "I will go to him now, if I may. I rather think I shall find him ready to pray once more by now." I tried to smile faintly. You've forgiven him his blasphemy, then? He made a philosophical gesture. If that is all that heaven is ever required to forgive in him, we shall be fortunate indeed, he said. And taking the candle from my nerveless hand, he lit it his way to the top of the silent house without another word. On Sunday, I walked down into the village with Marie, to shame the parents of our tormentors. It was some years now since I had worshipped in the magnificent abbey of St. George de Boscherville. Content to hear Mass like an invalid in the privacy of my own home, I had allowed myself increasingly to assume the habits of recluse, and I began to see that there was perhaps some justification for the general belief that a madwoman and a monster inhabited the secluded house on the outskirts of the village. I must not continue to hide away like a mole in its burrow. I must show that I was prepared to fight for our right to be left in peace. Throughout the service, I was aware of heads turning furtively in my direction. A muted whispering permitted the sermon, and even the priest's steely gaze was not sufficient to quell it. My resolve trembled, and I had a horrible urge to run out of the old church, but still I sat there stiffly with my gloved hands folded over my prayer book, willing the service to come to the end. Ita Messia est, said Father Matsuo at a merciful length, and as the congregation shuffled to its feet, I avoided the communal gaze by staring fixedly at the cherubs which decorated the transept. Following Marie into the nave, I dropped my prayer book in my agitation, and the reverberating thud echoed unnaturally loud up to the vaulted roof. My glance went automatically up to the gallery, and in the sufficient light from the clerestory window I saw the figure of a young man looking down on me thoughtfully. He made a formal little bow when he realized that I had seen him, and the unfamiliar courtesy of his gesture covered me with confusion. I had forgotten how to respond to such gestures in my years of solitude, forgotten how to play the simpering, empty-minded coquette. I felt extremely uncomfortable, and yet it was very hard to break that first revealing moment of eye contact. "Who is that man?" I asked Marie, as we walked out into the fierce sunlight which was bathing the village green. She smiled. "That is the new doctor, Monsieur Bear." "How long has he been in Boischerville?" "About 2 months, but they say he will not stay. I believe he has very few patients because everyone still prefers to call in Dr. Gautier." "How stupid," I said, rather more sharply than I meant to. "Dr. Gautier was in his dotage 10 years ago. The man must be 80 at least." Marie shrugged. "Well, you know what the village is. Mamma says she would never dream of being examined by such a young man, and she most certainly would not permit him to attend me." "What does your mamma suggest the young man do in the meantime? Is he to starve in the gutter until his beard turns gray?" "Hush," said Marie urgently. "He's coming out. He'll hear you." Against all the instincts of good breeding, I turned to look and found the young man's eyes once more fixed upon mine. Again he made that elegant little bow and bade us a good morning before going on his way with obvious reluctance. Marie took my arm, and with one accord we began to hurry down the road, away from his retreating figure. Suddenly, inexplicably, I found myself giggling, like the silly, frivolous creature I had once been. Suddenly I was back in the convent, half-heartedly denying my interest in a handsome singing master. But of course I don't care for him. Not a bit. Not a bit. 17 once more, a pert little butterfly testing her wings, after the restrictive, chrysalis years of a strict Catholic upbringing. 17 and ready to devour life in one eager, greedy swallow. The dusty, sun-baked road outside my house swam abruptly back into my vision, and the sun winked on the new pane of glass that Eric had fitted into the dining-room window. 8 years old, and already he was as swift and efficient on simple tasks as the best workman in the village. Why did I have the guilty feeling that I was about to commit the ultimate betrayal of his trust?